The tea was still steaming, a delicate porcelain cup of jasmine resting on the polished mahogany table between us. The room smelled of old paper, beeswax, and the sharp, clinical scent of Evelyn's expensive perfume. She sat across from me, her hand frozen midair, holding a gold fountain pen. For years, she had looked at me as if I were a temporary distraction in her son's life, a minor inconvenience she could sweep away with enough social pressure and financial leverage. But in that exact second, the color left her face. The silence in her study was absolute, save for the rhythmic, heavy ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. She looked down at the document I had placed before her, not the postnuptial agreement she had spent months trying to force me to sign, but a meticulously organized ledger of her own unauthorized transactions from the family trust. Her fingers trembled, the gold pen slipping slightly. She didn't speak. She couldn't. The absolute control she had spent a lifetime building had dissolved in a single, quiet moment. But to understand how we got to this moment, we have to go back 3 years. Before we continue the story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications for more videos like this. The afternoon sun was casting long, heavy shadows across our living room when I walked through the door after an exhausting 10-hour shift. I expected to find the quiet sanctuary I had spent years building with Julian, but instead, the air felt thick, charged with an unwelcome, intrusive energy. The front door hadn't been locked. As I stepped into the foyer, the faint, unmistakable scent of lavender soap and expensive French perfume drifted from the back of the hallway. It was Evelyn's signature scent, a fragrance that always preceded her arrival like a warning siren. My heart sank, a familiar knot tightening in my stomach. I walked toward my home office, the one space in this house that was entirely mine, a room where I kept my professional files, my personal journals, and the fragile remnants of my life before Julian. When I pushed the door open, my breath caught in my throat. Evelyn was standing in the center of the room, surrounded by cardboard boxes. She was holding a stack of leather-bound notebooks, my late mother's personal journals, the only physical connection I had left to her voice, her thoughts, and her warmth. Several of the journals had already been tossed into a large blue recycling bin resting by her feet. On my desk, my neatly cataloged tax documents, client folders, and financial archives had been completely shuffled, some shredded and resting in a heap at the bottom of a plastic wastebasket. Evelyn turned around slowly, her face wearing an expression of practiced, effortless innocence. She didn't startle. She didn't apologize. Instead, she adjusted her gold designer glasses and smiled, a cold, patronizing curve of her lips that never reached her eyes. She looked at me not as a homeowner finding an intruder, but as a queen inspecting a messy servant's quarters. She set my mother's journal down on the desk with a careless, heavy thud, brushing her hands together as if she had just touched something dusty and beneath her station. I stood in the doorway, my hands resting quietly at my sides. I didn't scream. I didn't demand to know what she was doing in my house, or why she had used the emergency key she had pressured Julian into giving her. Internally, a profound shift occurred. The small, accommodating voice inside me, the one that had spent years trying to keep the peace, trying to be the perfect daughter-in-law, went completely silent. In its place, a cold, analytical clarity took over. I looked at the shredded papers, I looked at my mother's journals, and then I looked directly into Evelyn's eyes. She thought my silence was fear. She thought my lack of reaction was submission, a sign that she had successfully broken my spirit and established her dominance. But she was entirely wrong. It was the exact moment I realized that peace was no longer an option. It was the moment I decided to stop defending and start observing. If you are listening to this right now, perhaps sitting in a quiet room or driving home after a long day of trying to please people who refuse to be pleased, I want you to take a deep breath. Settle in. I know what it feels like to live under the constant, suffocating weight of someone else's expectations. I know the exhausting dance of walking on eggshells, of carefully choosing every single word so as not to trigger a storm, of constantly shrinking yourself so that someone else can feel large. It is a lonely, draining way to exist. For 3 years, I believed that if I was just patient enough, kind enough, and respectful enough, the woman who ruled my husband's family would eventually see my value. I thought that by showing her grace, I could teach her how to give it. But some people do not want peace, they want compliance. They do not view your kindness as a bridge, they view it as a weakness, a soft spot where they can drive their heels in deeper. I am telling you this story not to complain, and certainly not to seek sympathy, but to show you what happens when the quietest person in the room decides to stop playing by rules that were designed to make them lose. The dynamic between Evelyn and me was toxic, a slow-burning poison that was quietly eroding my marriage and my self-worth. She was a master of psychological chess, always 3 steps ahead in her social circles, using her wealth, her family name, and her emotional hold over Julian to keep everyone in a state of perpetual dependence. She believed she was untouchable. She believed that because I came from a modest background, because I didn't shout or make scenes, I was a blank slate she could write her own terms upon. But she forgot one critical thing: the quietest people are often the ones who pay the most attention. They are the ones who watch, who listen, and who remember. What Evelyn never understood about me was that my silence was never a vacuum, it was an active choice. She saw my modest background and my calm demeanor as evidence of a simple mind that could be easily managed. She didn't know, or perhaps she chose to ignore, what I actually did for a living. I am a senior forensic auditor and compliance investigator for an international regulatory firm. My entire professional life is built around tracking hidden assets, dissecting complex financial webs, identifying systemic fraud, and finding the tiny, deliberate discrepancies that people in high places spend millions of dollars trying to conceal. I spend my days looking at spreadsheets, tax returns, trust agreements, and ledger entries. I know how to read between the lines of a legal document the way a seasoned detective reads a crime scene. I know that people who present the loudest, most flawless public facades are often the ones hiding the deepest, most chaotic secrets. I had never brought my work home. I had never wanted to look at my new family through the cold, suspicious lens of an auditor. I wanted to believe in Julian's love, and I wanted to respect the legacy his late father had built. But as I stood in my ruined office, looking at Evelyn's smug face, I realized that my professional training was the ultimate shield I had been denying myself. I had a hidden advantage she could never comprehend. She saw me as a defenseless girl from a working-class neighborhood who had lucked into her son's wealthy life. She didn't realize that I possessed the precise, systematic tools required to dismantle her entire empire, legally and quietly, from the inside out. I had stayed silent for years because I valued my marriage and because I wanted to protect Julian from the painful truth of his mother's character. But trust is a currency, and Evelyn had just gone completely bankrupt. The moment she laid her hands on my mother's journals, she crossed a boundary from which there was no return. I was done trying to earn her respect. I was going to let her own actions dictate her downfall. To understand the depth of Evelyn's control, You have to understand the history of this family. Julian's father, Arthur, had been a brilliant, self-made man who built a massive real estate and investment trust before he passed away 10 years ago. He was a man of integrity, highly respected in the community, and deeply dedicated to ensuring his family's long-term security. When he died, he left behind a highly structured family trust designed to provide for Julian, Julian's future children, and Evelyn herself. However, Arthur knew his wife's extravagant spending habits and her insatiable need for social status. To protect the core assets, he had structured the trust with very strict fiduciary guidelines. Evelyn was appointed as the primary trustee, but her power was supposed to be administrative, bound by tight legal constraints. But Evelyn didn't do boundaries. Over the decade following her husband's death, she slowly and systematically rewrote the narrative of the family's wealth. She convinced Julian that she was the sole architect of their lifestyle, that every dollar he had, every opportunity he was given, was a direct result of her personal generosity. She cultivated a deep, psychological financial dependence in him. Julian was a gentle soul, a talented landscape architect who loved his work but hated conflict. He worshipped his father's memory and trusted his mother implicitly. Evelyn used this trust like a weapon. Whenever Julian tried to make an independent decision, she would subtly remind him of the family legacy and how much she had sacrificed to keep the trust intact for him. She made him feel that any sign of independence was an act of profound ingratitude toward her. By the time I met Julian, he was a grown man who still had to ask his mother for permission to use his own trust allowance for major life decisions. I watched this pattern unfold month after month, observing how she used guilt and money to keep him on a short, golden leash. Evelyn's passive-aggressive campaign against me began the very day Julian introduced us. We met for lunch at an incredibly exclusive country club where she was a founding member. I wore a simple, elegant navy blue dress that I had saved up to buy for my first professional job interview. When Evelyn walked up to our table, she didn't look at my face. Her eyes slid down to my shoes, then to my purse, and finally to my dress. She let out a tiny, soft sigh, a sound of gentle pity that spoke volumes. When she finally spoke, her voice was sweet, dripping with artificial warmth. She told me how brave I was to wear such a simple outfit in a place like this, and how much she admired people who lived uncomplicated, budget-conscious lives. As the months went on, the comments became more frequent, more calculated, and increasingly public. At family gatherings, she would raise her glass to toast Julian's career, and then turn to me, asking loudly if my little auditing job was still keeping me busy, or if I was ready to step aside so I could focus on being a proper supportive partner to her son. She would buy Julian outrageously expensive designer suits, custom watches, and luxury trips, always presenting them in front of me while making remarks about how important it was for Julian to maintain his standard of living, regardless of his personal choices and partners. Julian, bless him, was completely blind to the malice behind her words. To him, his mother was just being protective, a bit eccentric, and incredibly generous. When I tried to gently point out the underlying hostility, he would look at me with genuine confusion and say, "Clara, she's just trying to help. She's always been like this. She doesn't mean anything by it. You're just being too sensitive." I realized quickly that arguing with Julian about his mother was a losing battle. It only drove a wedge between us, which was exactly what Evelyn wanted. She was trying to provoke me into an emotional outburst, a dramatic scene that she could use to prove to Julian that I was unstable, dramatic, and socially unsuitable for their family. I refused to give her that satisfaction. I smiled, I thanked her for her advice, and I took mental notes. The true escalation began when Julian and I decided to buy our first home. We wanted a modest, historic craftsman house in a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood close to our offices. We had saved up a substantial down payment from our combined salaries, wanting to do this on our own. But when Evelyn found out, she immediately intervened. She declared that a son of the family could not live in a run-down starter home, claiming it would damage their social standing. Within a week, she had purchased a massive, cold, modern estate in an ultra-wealthy gated community, completely on her own, and announced that she was gifting it to us. But it wasn't a gift. When we went to her office to sign the paperwork, I discovered that the deed was not in our names. It was held entirely by a subsidiary company owned by the family trust, of which Evelyn was the sole managing director. This meant we would be living there essentially as her tenants, subject to her rules, her inspections, and her absolute control. The house was filled with furniture she chose, art she approved of, and she kept a full set of keys, refusing to acknowledge our boundaries. Julian was thrilled, seeing it as an act of immense maternal love. I, however, saw it for what it truly was, a golden cage designed to strip us of our financial independence and keep us permanently under her thumb. It was during this time that Evelyn began her most insidious move yet. She started whispering in Julian's ear about the necessity of a postnuptial agreement. She framed it as a standard, modern legal precaution, a way to protect the family trust from outside liabilities. She told him that since the trust was providing our housing and supporting his lifestyle, it was only fair that I sign an agreement waiving any potential claim to the family assets, including any appreciation of value in our shared lives. Julian, trusting as always, brought the document home to me, looking incredibly uncomfortable. He told me his mother insisted on it, and that it would make things so much easier for everyone if I just signed it to keep her happy. When I opened the document, my professional instincts immediately flared. The agreement was not a standard protection document. It was a legal trap, drafted by Evelyn's personal high-priced attorneys, designed to strip me of my own personal, premarital assets, including my modest inheritance from my mother, and to ensure that if Julian and I ever divorced, I would leave with absolutely nothing, while she retained total control over our joint lives. They thought silence meant acceptance. It meant preparation. I looked at the postnuptial agreement resting on my desk, its heavy bond paper feeling cold and rigid in my hands. I looked at the signatures of the lawyers, the complex legalese designed to obscure the true, predatory nature of the terms. I didn't cry. I didn't storm into Evelyn's house to demand an explanation. Instead, I quietly carried the document to my home office, sat down at my desk, and opened a blank spreadsheet on my computer. You don't always have to shout to be heard. Sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is to become completely, utterly quiet and let your work speak for you. I knew that if I fought Evelyn openly, I would lose. She had the money, she had the high-priced legal team, and she had Julian's deep-seated loyalty. If I made this a battle of emotions, she would paint me as a gold digger who was trying to tear a mother away from her son. But a financial audit doesn't have emotions. A spreadsheet doesn't care about social status, family legacies, or tearful manipulations. It only cares about numbers. It only cares about the truth. I decided that before I signed anything, I needed to understand exactly what I was agreeing to protect. If Evelyn was so desperate to protect the family trust from me, I wanted to see what was actually inside that trust. As Julian's legal spouse, and under the terms of the very trust documents Arthur had drafted, which Evelyn had foolishly referenced in the postnuptial agreement, I had a legitimate legal right to review the trust's annual disclosures and administrative records. Evelyn had never provided these to Julian, and Julian had never thought to ask. I quietly asked Julian to sign a standard, formal request for a full accounting of his portion of the trust, framing it as a routine administrative step for our joint tax preparation. Julian, thinking nothing of it, signed the authorization form. I sent it directly to the trust's administrative bank, bypassing Evelyn's personal office entirely. When the bank boxes arrived at my office a few weeks later, I waited until Julian was away on a weekend business trip. I cleared off my dining room table, set up my high-speed document scanner, and began my work. The sheer volume of paper was staggering: 10 years of bank statements, investment portfolios, tax filings, corporate ledgers, and property transactions. To an untrained eye, it would have looked like a mountain of boring, standard administrative clutter. But to me, it was a map. I spent 48 hours straight sitting in the quiet of my home, illuminated only by the glow of my dual monitors and a single desk lamp. I ran complex data analytics across the transactions, cross-referencing cash outflows with the trust's strict fiduciary guidelines. Arthur's original trust charter was very clear. The funds were to be used solely for Julian's education, his primary living expenses, conservative long-term investments, and reasonable administrative fees. Evelyn was permitted a generous annual trustee management fee, but she was strictly forbidden from using trust capital for personal investments, high-risk ventures, or self-dealing. By Sunday night, my screen was filled with red flags. The numbers didn't lie. Trust is a currency, and Evelyn had gone completely bankrupt. Over the past 7 years, as the real estate market fluctuated, Evelyn had made a series of disastrous personal investments in luxury boutique hotels and high-risk fashion startups that had completely failed. To cover her personal losses and maintain her extravagant public lifestyle, she had quietly began systematically draining Julian's portion of the trust. She had set up a web of shell companies, dummy consulting firms, and unauthorized secondary trusts to funnel millions of dollars out of the main accounts. She had even forged Julian's signature on several major transaction authorizations, transferring ownership of key income-generating trust properties to companies she personally owned outright. The massive estate she had gifted us was actually purchased with Julian's own trust money, but structured so that she personally pocketed a massive administrative fee from the transaction. She wasn't protecting the family legacy from me. She was desperately trying to lock me into a legal agreement that would prevent me, or any future legal inquiry, from ever auditing the trust and discovering that she had spent years embezzling her own son's inheritance. As the weeks passed, I watched Evelyn with a new, profound sense of clarity. She had no idea what I had discovered. When we met for occasional family dinners, she seemed more confident than ever, her attitude toward me borderline triumphant. She assumed that my continued silence about the postnuptial agreement was a sign of my slow, inevitable defeat. At one dinner, she sat across from me, delicately cutting her steak, and asked with a thin, mocking smile if I had managed to find a notary yet, or if I needed her to send one of her personal assistants to my little office to help me understand the paperwork. I looked at her, feeling a strange, quiet pity. She was so entirely consumed by her own web of lies, so confident in her social armor, that she couldn't see the ground crumbling beneath her feet. I smiled back, took a slow sip of my water, and told her that I was just doing some final, routine reviews of the documentation to ensure everything was in order. Of course, Evelyn sneered softly, looking at Julian with a patronizing sigh. We must let Clara feel like she is doing her important little auditing work. It's cute how serious you take your job, dear. But let's not drag this out. The family assets need to be secured, and we have a major trust restructuring meeting scheduled for next month. I expect the signed agreement on my desk before then, or we will have to make some very difficult decisions regarding your living arrangements. Julian looked down at his plate, clearly uncomfortable but refusing to speak up. I reached over, gently squeezed his hand, and looked back at Evelyn. Don't worry, Evelyn, I said, my voice calm, steady, and entirely devoid of anger. Everything will be finalized by the time that meeting arrives. I promise you, you will have my complete, undivided attention. She nodded, satisfied, believing she had won. She didn't realize that every single day she spent gloating was another day I spent securing certified copies of bank records, forensic handwriting analysis of the forged signatures, and detailed transaction paths that traced her embezzlement directly into her personal offshore accounts. I was not reacting. I was preparing. The tipping point arrived on a Tuesday morning. I received an urgent, formal letter from Evelyn's personal legal team. It was a formal ultimatum, carbon copied to Julian. The letter stated that if the signed postnuptial agreement was not delivered to their offices by Friday at 5 p.m., the trust would immediately suspend all financial distributions to Julian, including his salary from the family's management company, and would initiate formal eviction proceedings for the house we were living in. It was a brutal, public show of force designed to completely crush my resistance and force Julian to pressure me into compliance. Julian panicked. He came home that evening white-faced, pacing the floor of our living room, clutching the letter in his trembling hands. "Clara, please," he begged, his voice cracking with emotion. "Just sign it. What difference does it make? We love each other. We aren't going to get divorced. My mother is losing her mind over this. She's threatening to ruin my career, to take away everything we've built. She's my mother, Clara. She wouldn't do this if she didn't think it was absolutely necessary for the family. Please, just do this for me. For our peace." I sat on the sofa, watching him. I didn't get angry at him. I didn't point out how deeply brainwashed he was, or how cowardly his silence had been over the years. I saw him for what he was, a victim of a lifetime of systematic psychological abuse and financial grooming. I stood up, walked over to him, and gently took the letter from his hands. "Julian," I said, looking directly into his eyes with absolute calmness, "I am not going to sign this document. But I promise you, this is going to end on Friday. I have scheduled a private meeting with your mother at her estate for Friday afternoon at 3 p.m. I want you to be there. I want you to sit in the room, and I want you to listen. After that meeting, if you still want me to sign it, I will. But you must promise me that you will stay for the entire conversation." Julian looked at me, utterly baffled by my calm demeanor, but he slowly nodded. He thought I was finally surrendering, that I was going to her estate to negotiate a peaceful surrender. He had no idea that the trap was already set and that his mother had just walked directly into it. The days leading up to Friday were quiet. I felt a profound sense of stillness, the kind of deep, unshakable peace that comes when you know you have done everything in your power to act with integrity, and that the truth is entirely on your side. I didn't spend my nights worrying. I spent them organizing my final presentation. I printed out 3 identical binders, bound in sleek, professional black covers. Inside each binder was a masterfully constructed forensic audit report. It began with a clear, high-level executive summary detailing the systemic breach of fiduciary duty by Evelyn. It was followed by color-coded transaction flowcharts showing exactly how trust funds were diverted through shell companies to her personal accounts. Next were the certified bank statements, the tax filings, and finally, the professional handwriting analyst's certified report proving that Evelyn had forged Julian's signature on multiple key documents to authorize unauthorized multi-million-dollar transfers. This was not a chaotic, emotional attack. This was a professional, clinical exposure of systemic fraud. I knew that Evelyn's entire identity, her social standing, her power over her son, and her freedom rested on the illusion of her absolute financial and moral authority. She believed she was a master chess player, but she had been playing against a mirror, completely blind to the fact that her opponent was not a submissive girl, but a highly trained investigator who spent her life exposing people exactly like her. Trust is a currency, and Evelyn had spent every last cent of it. The moment she decided to use Julian's financial security as a weapon to force my compliance, she signed her own eviction notice from his life. I placed the 3 binders in my briefcase, locked it, and took a deep, quiet breath. I was ready. The afternoon sun was filtering through the heavy lace curtains of Evelyn's private study, casting intricate, cage-like shadows across the polished mahogany table. The room was warm, almost stifling, smelling of expensive beeswax and the sharp, floral notes of her perfume. Evelyn sat behind her desk, looking like a high court judge, her posture rigid and triumphant. Julian sat to her right, looking incredibly anxious, his eyes darting between his mother and me. "Well, Clara," Evelyn said, her voice dripping with artificial condescension as she rested her manicured hands on the desk. "I'm glad you finally came to your senses. I assume you have the signed postnuptial agreement with you? We have our legal team on standby to finalize the trust documents." I didn't say a word. I opened my briefcase, pulled out the 3 black binders, and calmly placed one in front of Julian, one in front of myself, and slid the 3rd across the table to Evelyn. Evelyn looked down at the binder, her brow furrowing slightly. "What is this?" "This isn't the agreement." "No, it isn't," I said, my voice quiet, steady, and completely carrying the room. "That is a comprehensive, independent forensic audit of the family trust from the past 10 years. And before you say anything, Evelyn, I suggest you open it to page 12. She let out a sharp, dismissive laugh, but as she opened the binder and her eyes fell on the color-coded transaction charts, the laughter died in her throat. The silence in the room became absolute. The only sound was the heavy, rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. I watched her face. It was the moment they realized I wasn't the person they thought I was. The practiced, arrogant mask she had worn for decades began to crack, revealing a raw, naked panic underneath. "What is the meaning of this?" she whispered, her voice suddenly thin, her hand trembling as she stared at the certified copies of her signature next to the forged signatures of her son. "The meaning is very simple, Evelyn," I said, leaning forward slightly, my eyes locked onto hers. "Over the past 7 years, you have systematically embezzled over $4 million from Julian's trust to fund your personal investment losses. You have committed multiple counts of bank fraud, wire fraud, and grand larceny. You have forged your son's signature on legal documents, and you have violated your fiduciary duty as a trustee. The home we are living in was purchased with Julian's money, yet you structured it to pay yourself a massive, unauthorized consulting fee." Julian gasped, his face turning completely pale as he frantically flipped through the pages of his binder, his eyes widening as he saw the bank statements and the forged signatures. "Mother, what is this? Is this true?" Evelyn couldn't look at him. She stared at me, her chest rising and falling rapidly, her eyes filled with a mixture of terror and burning rage. You have no right to this information. You stole these records. This is family business." "I didn't steal anything, Evelyn," I replied calmly. Julian signed a formal, legal request for his own trust accounting, which is his absolute right under the law. As his spouse, I conducted the audit. Everything in that binder is certified, legally obtained, and fully documented. And as of 9 o'clock this morning, a complete digital copy of this file has been uploaded to a secure, external server managed by my firm's legal department. Evelyn looked as if she had been physically struck. She slumped back into her high-backed leather chair, her hands shaking so violently she had to drop the gold fountain pen she was holding. The silence in the room was deafening. Julian was staring at the forged signatures, tears welling up in his eyes. For his entire life, he had believed his mother was his protector, the one who kept him safe and secure. Now, looking at the cold, hard data, the illusion was completely shattered. "Julian," Evelyn stammered, her voice losing all of its authority, sounding desperately small. "Julian, sweetheart, listen to me. I did it for us. The investments, they were supposed to grow the family wealth. I was trying to protect us. Clara is trying to tear us apart. She's manipulating the numbers." "The numbers don't lie, Mother," Julian said, his voice surprisingly quiet, but filled with a deep, crushing pain. He looked at her as if seeing a stranger for the very first time. "You forged my name. You stole my inheritance. You threatened to evict us, to ruin my career, all to cover up what you did." Evelyn turned back to me, her eyes wild, her teeth clenched. "What do you want?" She spat, the mask of the elegant matriarch completely gone, replaced by a desperate, trapped animal. "Are you going to the police? Is that your plan? To ruin this family?" "I have no desire to ruin Julian's family name, Evelyn," I said, my voice remaining perfectly level. "But the dynamic of this family changes today. Here are my terms. First, you will immediately and permanently resign as the trustee of the family trust. A neutral, third-party corporate trustee will be appointed to manage all assets. Second, you will sign over all voting rights and management authority of the family's real estate holdings to Julian. Third, the house we are living in will be legally deeded directly to Julian and me, free and clear of any trust interference. And finally, you will retire from all public and family affairs. You will not contact Julian, and you will certainly never step foot in our home again." Evelyn stared at me, her mouth open in disbelief. "And if I refuse?" "If you refuse," I said, closing my binder with a soft, decisive click, "the digital file on our secure server will be automatically forwarded to the federal regulatory authorities and the district attorney's office at exactly 5 p.m. today. You are a forensic auditor's dream, Evelyn. The paper trail is flawless. You would be facing multiple felony charges, and at your age, I don't think you would survive a federal prison sentence." She sat there for what felt like an eternity, her eyes darting between the binder and the clock on the wall. The power dynamic had completely, irrevocably shifted. She was no longer the all-powerful matriarch who could dictate our lives with a stroke of her pen. She was a compromised, desperate woman facing the absolute ruin of her reputation, her freedom, and her lifestyle. Slowly, with trembling fingers, she reached into her desk drawer and pulled out a clean sheet of paper. She looked at Julian, her eyes pleading, begging for him to intervene, to defend her, to say something to stop this. But Julian sat perfectly still, his arms crossed, his gaze fixed on the mahogany table. He didn't say a word. He had finally realized that his mother's love was a transaction, and that she had spent his entire life selling him out. Evelyn looked at me, her eyes burning with a quiet, helpless hatred. She picked up her gold fountain pen, the same pen she had used to forge her son's signature, and signed the formal resignation and transfer documents I had prepared. She pushed them across the table to me, her hand shaking. "I hope you're happy," she whispered, her voice cold and hollow. "You've destroyed this family." "No, Evelyn," I said, quietly checking the signatures and placing the documents into my briefcase. "I didn't destroy anything. I simply audited the accounts. You destroyed this family the moment you decided to treat your own son's trust as your personal bank account. I just let the truth do the damage." We stood up to leave. Julian didn't look back at his mother. He walked out of the study, his shoulders slumped, but his stride steady. As I reached the door, I turned back to look at Evelyn one last time. She was sitting alone in her massive, dark study, surrounded by the expensive things she had stolen, looking incredibly small, fragile, and utterly powerless. The drive home was silent, but it was not the tense, suffocating silence of the past. It was a clean, quiet space where the air finally felt light enough to breathe. Julian held my hand tightly as he drove, his eyes focused on the road ahead. When we finally got home, he walked into our living room, looked around at the space we had built, and let out a long, deep breath, the breath of a man who had finally been released from a lifelong prison. In the months that followed, the transition of power was seamless and absolute. A reputable corporate bank took over the administration of the family trust, ensuring that all assets were properly managed and that Julian's inheritance was fully secured. The deed to our beautiful craftsman home was officially transferred to our names, completely free of any corporate or maternal strings. Evelyn quietly withdrew from all social circles, claiming health reasons for her sudden retirement from her various charity boards and country club committees. She lived out her days in her quiet estate, monitored by her lawyers, unable to interfere in our lives ever again. Julian and I had to do a lot of hard work to rebuild our relationship. The psychological damage of his mother's control didn't disappear overnight. But without her constant whispers, her passive-aggressive manipulation, and her financial leverage, we were finally able to build a partnership based on true honesty, mutual respect, and shared strength. He began to trust his own voice, his own decisions, and his own worth. And I finally had the quiet, peaceful sanctuary I had always wanted. Looking back on those 3 years, I realized that the greatest lesson I learned was about the nature of power. True strength does not lie in the volume of your voice, the size of your bank account, or your ability to dominate a room. True strength lies in patience, observation, and the quiet, unshakable commitment to the truth. Some people will always mistake your silence for weakness. They will assume that because you do not fight back, because you choose to be kind and respectful, you are easy to manipulate. But you must remember, silence is not submission. It is preparation. You don't always have to shout to be heard. Sometimes, the most devastating thing you can do to an oppressor is to simply stay calm, pay attention, and let the facts do the talking. If you are currently dealing with a toxic, controlling force in your life, whether it is a family member, a partner, or a boss, I want you to know that you are stronger than they think you are. Do not let them provoke you into their chaotic, emotional games. Keep your head down, document everything, stay quiet, and build your foundation. When the time is right, you won't need to scream. The truth will speak for itself. Thank you for staying with me until the very end of this journey. Where are you listening from? Please let me know in the comments below. And if this story brought you some value or peace today, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and like this video. Until next time, stay quiet, stay observant, and stay strong. Hashtag, hashtag, hashtag section, hashtag, hashtag, hashtag. Hashtag, hashtag, hashtag.